The testimony of buildings and bridges. So I know I already did a video on the testimony of bridges, but this is just going to add a little bit to that, since both bridges and buildings are built with their beams being at 90 degrees perpendicular. Okay? Parallel lines are two lines that are always the same distance apart and never touch. The fact that walls on buildings and columns or on bridges are parallel testify to the fact that the earth is flat. Indeed, no wall on any building on a spherical earth could be parallel if they are constructed using plumb bobs or spirit levels. How can it be verified that the earth is in fact flat by using weight plumb bobs? If two plumb bobs are hung from a bridge or any high platform, the lines attached to the plumb bobs will be the same distance apart at the top as at the bottom. The lines will always be parallel no matter how far apart they are hung. That parallel phenomenon could only happen on a flat earth. If the earth were a sphere, the spherical earth theory requires that the distance between the plumb bobs at the top would be greater than at the bottom. That is because on a spherical earth, the theory of gravity requires that a plumb bob, wherever it is on earth, must be pulled to the center of the earth. The vectors of the force of gravity would be like the spokes on a wheel splaying outward from the center of the wheel. The plumb bobs would follow the force vectors of gravity if the earth were a globe. But that is not what we see. What we see is that the lines holding the two adjacent plumb bobs will always be parallel no matter how far apart they hang. That could only mean that the earth is flat. Bridge columns and indeed building walls are designed and plumbed to be 90 degrees vertical. The walls and columns are parallel to one another in the real world. I live in the real world and have built buildings and other structures in the real world. In buildings, those structures I have made sure that the opposing walls were plumbed vertical and parallel to one another. Above is a photograph of a portion of the western span of the San Francisco Bay Bridge. Notice the suspension towers of the bridge, which are approximately 500 feet apart, are perfectly parallel as they rise 90 degrees vertically above the perfectly level water. There is no indication of any splaying from the surface of the water as Bowden alleges, and indeed would be required if the earth were a sphere. This bridge, and indeed all bridges in the world with their parallel 90-degree plumbed vertical suspension towers, testify that the earth is flat. Nick Berry was educated as a rocket scientist and aircraft designer, graduating with a master's degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering. He has had an internet blog called The Data Genetics, in which he claims that because of the curvature of the earth, the towers on the Golden Gate Bridge are a little wider apart at the top than at the bottom. Below is the image Berry posted showing his concept of the Golden Gate Bridge on a spherical earth. Berry calculated that the bridge towers should be 46.2 millimeters or 1 13/16 inches wider apart at the top than at the bottom. Berry states the top of the Golden Bridge is almost 2 inches wider at the top than the base because of the curvature of the earth. Below is a diagram depicting his conception, where L equals 1,280 meters and L plus X equals 1,280 meters, 0.0462 meters. The suspension towers on the Golden Gate Bridge are precisely 4,200 feet apart, which is the equivalent of approximately 1,280 meters. Berry's calculations are based upon the false premise that the Earth is a sphere. He clarifies that he thinks that the Earth is actually an oblate spheroid. I checked Berry's trigonometric calculations and obtained a slightly different answer of 1.55 inches, which is approximately 1 9/16 inches, for the added distance in our calculations, for the added distance between the top of the towers and the bottom. The difference in our calculations may be due to the fact that I assumed the radius of the Earth of 3,963 miles, whereas Berry assumed a radius of 3,959 miles. It makes no difference anyway, since the Earth is not a globe, and thus both figures are mythical. Barry seems to be living in a fantasy world. In the real world, the Golden Gate Bridge does not have suspension towers that splay out. The suspension towers on the Golden Gate Bridge that exist in the real world are perfectly parallel. Real engineers who were responsible for building the real Golden Gate Bridge created diagrams that clearly depict parallel suspension towers. The real engineers made no adjustments for a mythical spherical Earth. Indeed, the official website of the Golden Gate Bridge Highway and Transportation District depicts the spans of the Golden Gate Bridge at the top as being 4,200 feet apart. There is no indication of any compensation for a spherical Earth. Indeed, the engineering blueprints depict perfectly parallel suspension towers constructed 90 degrees vertical from their bases. The diagram of the Golden Gate Bridge below is from the June 22, 2012 engineering study titled Engineering the Golden Gate by Sarah L. Billington, Associate Professor Department of CEE, Stanford University, and David P. Billington, Jr., historian and independent scholar. The diagram was created by the Board of Engineers for the Golden Gate Bridge project. Leon Mossaif, Joseph Strauss, Othmar Aman, and Charles Derleth Jr. Notice that the diagram depicts a perfectly level mean high watermark. It also depicts a slight 10-foot bow upward in the center of the bridge as measured against the perfectly level mean high watermark. If there were any bow in the earth and resulting splaying in the towers, the drafters would have indicated that, just as they indicated the bowed roadway on the bridge. The suspension towers are perfectly perpendicular to the level water. The towers are perfectly plumb and parallel to each other. Notice also that the vertical support cables are also perfectly vertical and perfectly parallel with one another. Nick Berry's spherical Earth construct cannot hold up to scrutiny. The towers on the Golden Gate Bridge are diagrammed by the design engineers as parallel to one another. If one reads any treatise on bridge building, one finds that all bridges across water are constructed assuming that the water is perfectly flat and that the bridge columns will rise precisely plumb and perpendicular to the water. The towers are always diagrammed as being parallel to one another. That is because that is how bridges are in fact built on a flat Earth. Below is a diagram from the Akashi Kaiko Bridge, which is the world's longest suspension bridge. There are 1,991 meters between the suspension towers. The massive towers stand 282.8 meters in height over the water. Notice the measurement given for the distance between the towers in the diagrams is given from the top of the towers. That indicates that the engineers expected that there would be no deviation from the distance at the surface of the water from which they would begin the construction of the towers. The engineers planned for the towers to be vertically plumb and parallel. For example, the builders of the Akashi Kaiko Bridge built the bridge suspension towers perfectly vertical with exacting tolerances. They had to set the base caissons within 10 centimeters of perfectly level. The immense stresses placed upon the towers required that the towers be built vertically plumb. The Sumitomo Group Public Affairs Committee website explains just how carefully the builders were in ensuring that each tower was built perfectly vertical. If the caissons were placed even slightly off level, the towers would not stand vertically, so the foundations had to be set on the seabed at a depth of 60 meters, horizontal to less than a 10 centimeter margin of error. The seabed had to be leveled, and the caissons for the tower had to be laid horizontal with the level seabed, with less than 10 centimeters as the margin of error. Otherwise, the bridge would be out of specification. Apparently, the towers could only be adjusted 3.9 inches at their base to make up for any slight error in laying the caissons. Assuming the Earth is a globe, we find by using trigonometry that the Akashi Kaiko Bridge towers would be 3.17 inches further apart at the top than at the bottom. Suspension bridge towers are designed to withstand massive downward compression loads, but they are not designed for massive lateral loads. If the towers are not vertically plumb and parallel, it would put added lateral stress on the towers. If the earth were a sphere, no walls on any buildings or columns on any bridges would be parallel. The fact that all walls on square buildings and all columns on bridges built in the real world are designed and built to be parallel is proof that the earth is flat. For example, below is a picture of the New York skyline. It is clear to see that the skyline is perfectly level. This is confirmed by the fact that the vertical walls on the buildings that are more than a mile apart are parallel to one another. The walls and floors of all buildings are built using levels. Levels create perfectly plumb vertical walls. The fact that the plumb vertical walls are also perfectly parallel means that the earth cannot be a sphere. In the above picture of the New York skyline, the lines placed along the side of the vertical walls of the buildings more than a mile apart have been extended past the height of the antenna at the top of the Freedom Tower. The tip of the antenna is 1,792 feet in height above the ground. If the earth were a globe, the vertical lines running from the walls would not be parallel as they are, in fact, would not be parallel, but would be splayed apart at an angle of approximately 0.015 degrees, which is approximately 1 minute of arc. If the earth were a sphere, the extended vertical lines would be splayed out a distance of approximately 5.43 inches apart, further at the height of the antenna than at ground level. But that is not what we see. What we see is that the vertical lines remain perfectly parallel. Indeed, the vertical lines could be extended to infinity and they would remain perfectly parallel, thus indicating that the earth is flat. Even in the unusual case when a building is designed with angled walls, like the Freedom Tower depicted in the photograph above, the floors on such buildings are always horizontally level and parallel to the ground, as well as being horizontally parallel to all floors on other buildings. With some exceptions like the Freedom Tower, almost all buildings have walls that are perpendicular, which is 90-degree vertical, to level ground. The fact that almost all buildings are designed with walls that are plumbed vertical, and that age-old construction method results in the opposing walls being perfectly parallel to one another, can mean only one thing. The earth is flat. The Freedom Tower, which is the tallest building depicted in the picture above, was built to replace the destroyed World Trade Center towers. The original blueprints of the North Tower of the World Trade Center were leaked to the media in 2007 by a whistleblower. Those blueprints prove both that the Earth is flat and that 2002 FEMA performance study and the 2005 NIST report on the collapse of the Twin Towers were deceptive cover-ups. Hoffman, Roberts, and Hoyer explained that the blueprint drawings contain a wealth of detail about the buildings, including the dimensions of the structural members. The original blueprints of the North Tower revealed that the FEMA and NIST reports were misleading regarding the massive core columns. The FEMA and NIST reports gave the false impression that the Twin Towers were weakly constructed. How could blueprints of a building prove that the Earth is flat? Because the blueprints show that the North Tower was built as a perfectly square cuboid with each corner chamfered 6 feet and 11 inches. The blueprints show that the horizontal width for each side of the building was precisely 207 feet and 2 inches. That dimension ran from the bottom to the top of the building. The North and South World Trade Centers were sister towers with exactly the same exterior dimensions. The North and South Tower buildings were both 110 stories tall. The North Tower rose 1,368 feet from the ground to its roof. Other than their corners chamfered, the Twin Towers were perfectly square cuboids. The North Tower had exactly the same dimensions, with each side of the building being 207 feet and 2 inches wide. At the 111th floor, 1,368 feet above the ground, as it did at the first floor at ground level. Such an occurrence would not be possible if the Earth were a globe. Using trigonometry, we find that if the Earth were a sphere, the 110th floor should have been splayed out from the base by 0.16 inches. One might think that the 3/16 of an inch is not very much of a difference in width between the first floor and the 110th floor. But when one realizes that the tower was built using massive steel girders that were prefabricated off-site in uniform dimensions with preset holes, it becomes clear that the tower could not be built with any deviation in floor dimension. That is because the holes for the bolts and rivets must line up perfectly in order for the structure to be assembled. The holes on the girders would line up perfectly on the ground floor, but they would be almost 3/16 of an inch off center by the time the steel workers reached the 110th floor. Indeed, this problem would gradually manifest itself long before the steel workers ever reached the 110th floor. The girders could not be assembled because the holes for the bolts and rivets would not line up, and steel girders do not stretch. Indeed, this would be an issue for all four walls of the building, as the splaying outward of the walls and corners would be in all directions on each floor. The architectural diagrams for the North Tower indicate that it was designed to have each side of each successive floor measure horizontally precisely 207 feet and 2 inches. There is no indication in the architectural drawings for a 3/16 inch allowance for the splaying out of the walls as the tower rose from the ground of a supposedly spherical earth to the 110th floor. The blueprints list the dimensions of every single one of the 110th floors as having a horizontal measure of precisely 207 feet and 2 inches. Such could only be the case on a flat earth.